A teenager is openly humiliated by Judge Richard Hale in a crowded courtroom. The judge arrogantly belittles the boy, mistaking him for an ignorant troublemaker. However, when the teen calmly produces legal credentials, the courtroom gasps, realizing he's no ordinary kid. "You seriously thought you could waste my courtroom's time dressed like this?" sneered Judge Richard Hale, eyes coldly fixed on the boy in faded jeans and a hoodie standing silently before him. Courtroom 5A in Brooklyn buzzed with whispers, lawyers exchanging smirks, and defendants leaning forward eagerly. Hale relished the attention, soaking in the authority of his raised bench like a throne. "Speak up, boy. This isn't your neighborhood hangout." Hale spat, his voice dripping with disdain. In the jury box, spectators watched nervously. Among them, eyes narrowed with concern, confusion thickening the atmosphere. Yet, the teenager stood unmoved, shoulders relaxed, hands calmly in pockets. He seemed unfazed by the judge's venomous tone, even as Hawley's contempt flared brighter. "I asked you a question. Is this some joke to you?" The boy slowly removed one hand from his pocket, revealing a folded paper. His calm gesture infuriated the judge further, veins pulsing visibly beneath Hawley's thinning hairline. "Officer, bring me whatever nonsense he's holding." "Maybe a forged ID," H.M.R. mocked Hale, confident in his verdict of superiority. The bailiff hesitated, then retrieved the paper, handing it to Hale, whose arrogant smirk quickly dissolved into shock. The judge started, mouth agape, his hand trembling slightly. "Is this?" Hawley's voice cracked with disbelief. The teenager finally spoke, voice calm and measured yet devastatingly authoritative. "Yes, Your Honor, my credentials from Columbia Law. I'm representing the defendant today." Gasps rippled across the courtroom, whispers erupted into astonishment. Hawley's confidence shattered, his arrogant veneer slipping, replaced by dread, and, respectfully, Judge Hale, the teen's eyes flashed sharply. "It's your integrity, not mine, that's now in question." Hale froze, the gavel slipping from his grasp, clattering to the floor. All eyes fixated on the young attorney as the courtroom sank into stunned silence. By the next morning, Brooklyn was abuzz with whispers. The courthouse hallways were thick with quiet conversations, murmurs punctuated by curious glances and skeptical stares. "Did you hear about Hawley's courtroom yesterday?" whispered Melissa, a young paralegal, her voice tight with excitement. The kid, barely old enough to drive, he embarrassed the judge. Nearby, clusters of clerks glanced nervously at Hawley's closed office door, exchanging furtive nods. Rumors swirled, reputations trembled like leaves caught in a storm. The once impenetrable Judge Hale was suddenly vulnerable, exposed by the calm, unassuming teenager. Inside his office, Hale sat at his polished mahogany desk, the morning sun streaming through tall, ornate windows onto walls lined with certificates and commendation, symbols of his long-standing authority. Yet now, in their quiet splendor, they mocked him. Hawley's fingers clenched the edge of his desk as yesterday's humiliation replayed ceaselessly in his mind. "My credentials from Columbia Law. I'm representing the defendant today." That simple, composed sentence had shattered him. Hale closed his eyes, jaw tight. A sinking dread crept upward from his gut, knotting his stomach. For decades, his power had gone unquestioned until Ethan Reeves had walked into his courtroom. A sharp knock startled Hale, pulling him from his thoughts. "Come in," he barked, forcing authority back into his voice. Assistant District Attorney Lauren Campbell entered briskly, a thick file in her grip. Her professional demeanor couldn't mask the subtle curiosity flickering behind her eyes. "Judge Hale, the media is requesting interviews. Everyone wants to talk about." She hesitated, eyes flickering downward. "The incident yesterday." Hawley's irritation surged. "Incident," he snapped. "That insolent boy mocked this court." "That's your incident." Campbell shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, respectfully. The press sees it differently. Ethan Reeves is already being called a prodigy. His story is going viral." Hawley's eyes flashed angrily. "I won't dignify this circus," he spat, A teenage lawyer. Absurd. Make sure no one forgets that. But Campbell's silence spoke volumes. Hale knew perceptions had already shifted. Ethan Reeves wasn't the insolent child he'd initially thought. Doubt gnawed at Hawley's pride, feeding into his simmering panic. Across town, Ethan entered his small, cluttered apartment. Law books stacked meticulously against walls. Notes spread neatly across his desk. The room, modest yet organized, a clear reflection of his mind. The young attorney paused, glancing at the newspaper lying open on the table. His own face stared back, calm, confident beneath a headline, "Teen Genius Shocks Judge, Rocks Courtroom." The attention didn't flatter him. Rather, it deepened the weight on his young shoulders. Ethan knew the stakes of this case weren't simply his reputation. They represented every underestimated person who'd stood defenseless before the likes of Hale. His phone buzzed repeatedly, calls, messages flooding in. Ignoring them, Ethan quietly settled behind his desk. Fingers flying across the keyboard, he focused solely on strategy, ignoring distractions. His composure was his armor, dignity his shield. A gentle knock on his door broke his concentration. Opening it, he saw his client, Marcus Holloway, a young black man falsely accused of robbery, standing nervously in the hallway. "Come in, Marcus," Ethan said warmly. Marcus stepped inside, glancing anxiously around the modest room. "I just came to say thanks," Marcus said quietly, shifting on his feet. "Nobody's ever fought for me like you did yesterday." Ethan offered a reassuring smile. "You deserve justice, Marcus. Everyone does." Marcus hesitated, voice strained with doubt. "But that judge hates us. Are you sure we can win?" Ethan met his gaze, eyes clear and steady. "I'm sure. Truth doesn't hide forever. Hawley's power comes from fear, but yours comes from truth." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly, encouraged by Ethan's quiet confidence. As Marcus left, Ethan returned to his notes, deepening. Hawley's arrogance wasn't just his weakness, it was Ethan's opportunity. Back at the courthouse, whispers became louder. Courtroom 5A slowly filled with spectators drawn by anticipation. Lawyers glanced nervously at Hale, who sat silently, avoiding their eyes. Ethan entered calmly, nodding politely to colleagues whose stares ranged from admiration to disbelief. As the session began, Ethan stood, addressing the jury clearly, powerfully dismantling the prosecution's arguments point by point. His voice, measured yet sharp, filled every corner of the courtroom, undeniably authoritative. "The state's evidence is circumstantial, their narrative driven by prejudice rather than fact," Ethan declared firmly, his words resonating deeply. Hale watched, throat dry, heart heavy with uncertainty. The boy he'd belittled yesterday stood transformed, no longer a mere teenager, but a powerful advocate, reshaping the narrative Hale had built his entire career upon. That evening, Hale stared at his reflection in the darkened courthouse window. The lights of the city glimmered behind him, yet he felt alone, the arrogant judge slipping away, leaving only doubt and vulnerability behind. He knew the whispers wouldn't stop. The whispers had become louder than his gavel, and the young attorney, Ethan Reeves, had quietly, irrevocably changed everything. The sound of leather shoes echoed down the corridor, slow, deliberate, and tense. Ethan Reeves walked into courtroom 5A as if he owned no fear, carrying a single slim folder. Every step he took silenced the murmurs. The courtroom, once a playground for mockery, had become a proving ground. Judge Hale sat tall at the bench, but his fingers drummed the wood unconsciously, betraying his nerves. The bailiff announced the case, and the crowd leaned in. "The People versus Marcus Holloway." Ethan rose as the courtroom doors closed behind the last observer. "Ready, Your Honor," Ethan said, voice calm. Beside him, the prosecutor assistant, Glenn Turner, flipped through his thick files with an arrogant grin. "This'll be quick," he whispered to his assistant. The judge gave a slight nod, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed him. His eyes lingered too long on Ethan. Turner began with flair, walking the jury through evidence that sounded, on the surface, like an open and shut case. Security footage, an eyewitness. A suspect who ran. Then Ethan stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move from his place. He didn't need to. "I'd like to begin," he said, "by calling attention to the facts the prosecution conveniently ignored." Turner smirked. Ethan turned slightly toward the jury, never taking his hands from the lectern. The video, grainy, shot from above, shadows distort everything. And the man in the footage, left-handed? "My client, Marcus Holloway, is not." Turner's smirk faded. "The eyewitness," Ethan continued. "That would be Mr. Randall Klein, a man with 3 prior complaints of false identification against black men in similar jackets. All dropped, all uninvestigated." Judge Hawley's gavel hit the wood. "Mr. Reeves, stick to facts, not character assassination." Ethan turned, respectful but steady. "I am, Your Honor. These are documented reports, already in evidence. I can provide copies for the court if necessary." Murmurs swept the room. The judge blinked. "Proceed." Ethan returned to the jury. "And finally the running," he said. "The prosecution claims Marcus fled, but where's the proof? No video. No officer ID. Just a neighborhood stereotype." Turner stood up. "Objection. Defense is editorializing." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm quoting the officer's own report. Your Honor, he described the suspect as a young black male in a hoodie. That's it. That's what led to my client being tackled and arrested." He paused, letting the silence speak. Then he stepped forward for the first time. One slow step. "I don't ask you to ignore evidence," Ethan said. "I ask you to look closer. Bias hides in plain sight, and the burden of proof lies with those pointing the finger." Turner's face flushed. The courtroom was still. Judge Hale shifted in his seat, eyes flickering between Ethan and the jury. His gavel rested in his hand. "UNMOVING." Ethan nodded once and sat down. The next witness, a forensics analyst, was cross-examined with surgical precision. Ethan never raised his voice, never stumbled. He asked only 3 questions, each dismantled a piece of the case. When Turner tried to object, he faltered. His rhythm broke, his narrative unraveled. Outside, reporters gathered. Inside, Hale watched his courtroom change. That night, Hale sat in his chambers long after the building had emptied. The day's events gnawed at him. He looked down at the paperwork in front of him, untouched. Legal texts, precedent book stools. He once wielded with confidence, now felt hollow. How could a boy dismantle a system so carefully built? His pride tried to find flaws in Ethan, too confident, too polished. Maybe someone's coaching him. But no evidence supported it. The boy knew the law, knew it was cold, and worse, he knew how to communicate it. Ethan wasn't trying to win by spectacle. He was using the system the way it was meant to be used, fairly, surgically, truthfully. Hale leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. A crack in the plaster caught his eye. It had always been there, small, invisible, easily ignored. But now, under pressure, it has widened, just like his courtroom. Meanwhile, Ethan walked alone through the city, hoodie pulled up, bag slung over one shoulder. The courthouse behind him glowed beneath flickering street lamps. He didn't smile, didn't strut. His victories were never loud, but his footsteps calm, certain, deliberate, echoed across the quiet night like a new kind of justice being born. By the 3rd day of the trial, Courtroom 5A felt less like a courtroom and more like a theater. Camera crews loitered on the courthouse steps, journalists jostled for sound bites, and Ethan Reeves, Brooklyn's newest enigma, had become the story of the hour. Teen attorney or legal legend in the making. Read one article headline: "Can the boy outsmart the bench?" Another teased. Inside the courthouse, murmurs echoed louder, bolder. Clerks gossiped over coffee. Security guards swapped theories. Even seasoned lawyers sat in the back rows, eyes fixed on the boy in the hoodie. But behind the courtroom doors, the tension was thick, and Judge Hale could feel it crawling beneath his robe like heat under armor. He gripped the bench harder than usual that morning. The robe that once symbolized untouchable authority now felt heavy, stifling, like a lie. "Bring in the jury," he said, voice tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. Ethan sat quietly at his table, flipping through notes, unbothered by the cameras, the whispers, or the weight of spectacle. His calm unnerved Hale more than defiance ever could. Assistant Turner entered flustered, a yellow stain on his white collar hinting at the stress of a morning spent dodging press questions. "We need to strike back," Turner hissed as he sat beside Ethan. "He's playing the long game, making you look soft." Hale narrowed his eyes. "He's not playing a game," Hale muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone. The bailiff called for silence. Turner took the floor, again, pushing harder, faster, throwing every angle he had at the jury. Confusion, fear, doubt. But Ethan remained patient. Let him burn himself out, his calm posture seemed to say. Then Ethan stood. He didn't speak immediately. He walked to the projector screen. With a quiet click, he displayed the still frames from the security footage side by side. The room leaned. "In frame 1, he said. "The suspect, caught on a blurry camera. Watch the left hand, the one reaching for the stolen wallet." Click. "Frame 2, Ethan pointed. "My client was handcuffed 2 blocks away." For minutes later, notice the dominant hand. He signs his name with his right. Turner's mouth tightened. Ethan turned to the jury. "The prosecution story depends on you not looking too closely. But when you do, you'll see this isn't just about misidentification. It's about assumption." He let the last word settle in the air. Assumption. The kind that kept kids like Marcus behind bars. The kind that made judges like Hale smirk at boys in hoodies. The kind that society ignored. Until now, Judge Hale shifted. Something inside him, something he hadn't acknowledged. Twitched. After recess, Hale returned to his chambers. He shut the door gently, then turned the lock. He paced. The whispers weren't just coming from the hallway anymore. They were inside him now. You mocked him. You underestimated him. You dismissed him before you heard a single word. The words were played in his head with every news segment, every viral video clip showing his stunned face as Ethan calmly presented his credentials. He looked at his reflection in the glass-paneled cabinet across the room. His jaw was clenched, lines around his eyes deeper than last week. He was losing control. Worse, he was losing narrative, reputation. Once built brick by brick, was now crumbling in public, not with a scandal, not with a crime, but with truth, quiet, undeniable, devastating truth. Later that day, as the court reconvened, Hale tried to reclaim control. He interrupted more, sustained objections faster. His tone became clipped, colder, sharper. But Ethan didn't blink. Even under pressure, his voice remained steady. No smugness, no retaliation, just facts, laid bare with surgical precision. By the time the court adjourned, the jury looked visibly different. They weren't just watching a case anymore. They were witnessing a shift, an earthquake beneath the floorboards of the system. Reporters hounded Ethan outside the courthouse, but he said little. Just one sentence, spoken quietly: "Let the evidence speak." And it had. It was screaming now. That night, in the stillness of his apartment, Ethan stared out the window as rain tapped gently against the glass. He wasn't celebrating, because this wasn't a game. He hadn't come to destroy Hale or win headlines. He'd come to protect a man falsely accused and challenge a system that believed appearance was guilt. But he knew Hale was unraveling, and the next move wouldn't come from the bench. It would come from the people, from the truth, from justice. And Ethan would be ready. The resistance didn't come with screams or slurs. It came in the form of misplaced files, last-minute schedule changes, sudden technical difficulties with courtroom equipment, all quiet tactics, silent attempts to stall, confuse, unnerve. But Ethan Reeves never flinched. On the fourth morning, as he entered courtroom 5A, the projector he'd requested for his presentation was mysteriously unavailable. He didn't argue. He simply pulled out printed slides, already annotated, and passed them to the jury himself. They say technology fails, he said with a soft smile. Paper doesn't, the jury chuckled. Even Hale cracked the faintest twitch of a frown. Small victories, silent wins. Behind the scenes, the legal community was divided. Some admired Ethan, others hated what he represented. Change. This kid's disrespecting the entire profession. One senior defense attorney scoffed to another in the hallway. It's not how we do things. How we've done things, corrected a younger lawyer nearby, his voice sharp. He's doing it better than any of us. Ethan heard every whisper, every sideways glance, but he never responded. He didn't need to. His strategy was simple. Let the truth speak louder than their ego. Back in court, Ethan cross-examined the arresting officer. The man shifted uncomfortably on the stand, sweat visible beneath his collar. You stated in your report that the suspect sprinted down West 23rd. Correct. Yes, the officer replied. Ethan tilted his head. And yet, my client was found on East 19th. Walking, no signs of exertion, for blocks away. In the opposite direction, the officer blinked. No scuffed shoes, no heavy breathing. No witnesses reporting anyone running near that area. Ethan continued. Does that align with someone fleeing a crime scene? The officer fumbled. Well, maybe he took a different route. Did you confirm that with any camera footage? No, but did you even check? The officer fell silent. Ethan turned back to the jury. Assumption again. Not investigation. Judge Hale cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Ethan's logic was airtight, his tone respectful. Even when cornering lies, outside the courthouse, Marcus's mother waited each day, clutching her purse with trembling fingers. She rarely spoke, but on that day, as Ethan walked past, she stopped him. My son. He's not a bad kid, she whispered. I know, Ethan said gently. You're not just helping him. You're helping people like us. Ethan paused, humbled. That's why I'm here. No speeches. No promises. Just the truth. That evening, Judge Hale sat in his office, staring at a typed complaint on his desk. Someone had filed a formal objection to Ethan's courtroom presence, citing inexperience and public disruption. He didn't need to guess who had submitted it. The language reeked of Turner. For a moment, Hale considered signing it. After all, Ethan had embarrassed him, made him look like a fool. But then he looked at the evidence, at the facts, at the still frames, at the officer's contradictions, and worst of all at his own conduct that first day. The robe he wore no longer felt like protection. It felt like a mirror. He folded the complaint and quietly placed it in the shredder. Some truths couldn't be undone. Later, that night, Ethan studied alone. No entourage, no celebrations, just books, case files, and quiet music humming in the background. The city pulsed outside his window, unaware of the quiet war being fought inside a single courtroom, not with weapons, not with anger, but with precision, with truth, with silent strength, and in a system built to ignore boys like him. Ethan had learned one thing early. You don't have to shout to change everything. You just have to keep standing. The courthouse smelled different that morning, like pressure, sweat, paper, old stone, fear. Reporters clustered outside the doors like vultures. Inside, the walls echoed with tension, each footstep heavier than the last. The Holloway trial had become more than a case, it was a reckoning. And at the center of it sat Judge Richard Hale, quietly cracking. He hadn't slept. The lights in his office had burned through the night. News anchors dissected every clip of him. Twitter trended with hashtags mocking his arrogance. Even the mayor's office had called not to scold him, but to ask if everything was all right. That was worse. The pity. Ethan walked into courtroom 5A carrying nothing but a notebook. His hoodie was zipped up, neat, charcoal gray. No tie, no briefcase. Still calm. He nodded at the jury. Some of them smiled back now, just slightly, not because they liked him, but because they trusted him. That was dangerous. Judge Hawley's gavel hit harder than usual. this court will come to order, he snapped, his voice sharper than needed. Mr. Reeves, I suggest you keep your cross-examination brief. This is a courtroom, not a lecture hall. Ethan stood slowly, not reacting. Understood, Your Honor. But his tone low, respectful, unshaken only deepened Hawley's frustration. Turner stood next, ready to put one of his star witnesses on the stand, the store manager where the alleged theft had occurred. A well-dressed man took the oath, gaze darting between Turner and Ethan like a nervous child picking sides. Do you recognize this man? Turner asked, pointing at Marcus Holloway. I believe that's the man who ran out of the store that day, the manager replied. Turner smiled triumphantly. Thank you, but then Ethan stepped forward. Mr. Grayson, he said softly. Do you often work at the front counter? Sometimes, yes. On the day in question, were you there the entire time? Well, I stepped out briefly to help unload a delivery. Ethan nodded. So, when you came back, you saw someone running? But you didn't see them take anything, did you? Grayson hesitated. No, not directly. And in the security footage, Ethan continued, pulling out a blown-up frame from his notebook, the person running wearing a different color hoodie than my client. Light gray, not navy blue. Isn't that true? Grayson looked at the photo. Then at Marcus. He nodded. Yes, that's true. Turner bolted up. Objection irrelevant. Hale snapped. Sustained. Ethan turned toward the judge. Your Honor, this is court to the case. If the witness can't confirm what he saw, then you will not tell me how to run my courtroom, Hale shouted, slamming the gavel so hard the head cracked. Gasps rose. Ethan stood still, unmoved. Hawley's chest rose and fell. His face flushed. Silence spread like ink through the room. Apologies, Hale muttered at last, regaining control. Continue. But the damage was done. Not to Ethan. To Hale. The jury saw it. The public saw it. And worst of all, Hale saw it. Outside the courthouse, protesters had started gathering. Small signs, quiet chants, truth over power. Listen before you judge. Hoodie does not equal guilty. Inside the building, other judges and staff whispered nervously in break rooms. Hawley's composure wasn't just slipping, it was fracturing. The young man he'd once mocked was exposing a truth too big to ignore, that the robe didn't make the man. And silence didn't equal justice. That night, Hale sat alone in his office again. The courthouse had emptied. He stared at the cracked gavel, the one he'd broken in anger. In 22 years on the bench, he'd never done that. Ethan's voice echoed in his memory. Assumption, not investigation. Was that what he'd become? A man who assumed. He thought back to every time he dismissed a defendant based on appearance, every time he'd looked at a hoodie and saw guilt, every time he raised his voice not to restore order but to suppress dissent. And now the mirror had cracked, and he didn't like what stared back. Meanwhile, Ethan walked the city streets, alone again, past flickering lights and neon signs, past kids who looked like Marcus, hoods up, heads down. He didn't celebrate today's slip. He didn't smile at the judge's outburst, because his mission wasn't to humiliate Hale. It was to wake him up. This wasn't about winning. It was about breaking the cycle, and Ethan knew he was getting close. In the basement of the Brooklyn Law Archives, the air smelled of dust and quiet secrets. Ethan stood between shelves stacked high with court transcripts, case files, and forgotten justice. His fingers traced worn folders, eyes scanning dates and names, case after case. Same judge, same pattern, minority, defendant, weak evidence, harsh sentence, over 30 files, and not one acquittal. He sat at the wooden research table, pages spread around him like pieces of a puzzle long hidden. There it was, not corruption with money or bribes, but something quieter, more poisonous. Biased. Patterned, documented, ignored. Ethan's jaw clenched as he highlighted the names. Boys like Marcus, men in hoodies, women without legal teams. All cut down by one man's assumptions dressed up as law. Judge Hale. That afternoon, Ethan returned to courtroom 5A with a different weight in his walk. He wasn't just defending Marcus now, he was exposing something bigger. Turner was already at his table, visibly frustrated. Hale sat stiffer than ever, fingers tapping the bench in a nervous rhythm. The jury sensed it too, an invisible shift in gravity. Something was coming. Ethan rose. Your Honor, he began calmly, I request the court's permission to submit supplemental evidence, relevant case law, and prior rulings. Turner snapped his head up. Objection. Irrelevant to the current charges. Ethan didn't flinch. On the contrary, this is a matter of systemic context. Patterns of judgment that directly impacted my client's arrest and pretrial treatment. Hale narrowed his eyes. You're threading a dangerous line, Mr. Reeves. I'm threading a truthful one. Ethan replied softly. A pause. Then, to everyone's surprise, Hale nodded. Proceed. The courtroom held its breath. Ethan walked to the center, holding a slim, bound folder. No theatrics, no dramatic tone. 32 prior cases, he said, all presided over by this court, all involving Black or Latino defendants, all resulting in maximum sentencing, many with minimal or questionable evidence. He laid a page on the screen. Case number 2187. No DNA. No witnesses. 5-year sentence. Case number 2194. Charges dropped later, but after 11 months in Rikers. He didn't accuse. He didn't attack. He simply revealed. And it hit harder than any speech. Your Honor, Ethan said at last, turning toward Hale, this isn't about one man on trial. It's about the invisible weight some carry every time they walk into a courtroom. It's about the invisible tilt some benches take before a single word is spoken. Judge Hale looked at the documents, face unreadable. But his eyes, once sharp with judgment, now trembled with something far older. Guilt. In chambers. Hale sat frozen. The file sat open before him. Not the one Ethan handed in court, but one he dug up himself last night. Case #1991. He remembered it clearly. A young boy, barely 17, shoplifting. He'd given him the full sentence. Even after the boy's mother had begged for leniency, he told himself it was to teach discipline, but what he really meant was to make an example of someone who looked like trouble, who looked like Ethan, a boy with sharp eyes and quiet fire. Hawley's hands trembled. His whole career, his entire legacy was built on decisions like that. And now the world saw, back in court, Ethan closed his folder, stepping aside. No speech. No smirk, just a nod. Your Honor, I rest my presentation. Turner rose, but the energy was gone. His notes felt empty. His argument cracked. No one listened, because the courtroom had seen something undeniable. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was about who got the benefit of the doubt and who never did. Hale called for recess. But as the room emptied, his voice lacked force. His gavel hit softer. The rope weighed heavier. And in the back of the room, a court reporter whispered to a bailiff, "It's like watching a statue melt." Later that evening, Ethan sat quietly at his desk, files neatly organized. He didn't watch the news, didn't scroll headlines. He already knew what the city was saying. Instead, he opened a new case file. Another man accused, another hoodie, another assumption. He would take that case too, because it wasn't just about winning. It was about unearthing truths that had been buried for too long. And Ethan Reeves had learned something powerful. Truth didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered until you couldn't ignore it anymore. The sun streamed through the courtroom windows, spotlighting the silence. Courtroom 5A wasn't just full, it was packed. Journalists sat shoulder to shoulder with off-duty attorneys, college students, and city officials. Even rival judges were there, perched in the back rows, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. They weren't here for Marcus Holloway anymore. They were here to see what a teenager was about to do to the system. Ethan Reeves rose from his chair like the calm before a storm. His notebook remained closed. He didn't need it. He stepped to the center, where the light hit hardest. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case has never been about robbery." Pause. "It's about reflex." He turned slightly, voice unwavering. A man was walking home. He matched a vague description: hoodie, skin tone, nothing more. And based on that, he was arrested. Some jurors nodded. Slowly, "But arrest," Ethan said, "isn't proof. It's a beginning, not an ending." And too often for men who look like Marcus it becomes the ending. No evidence, no logic, just assumption dressed up in fear. He took one more step. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the contradictions, and you've seen the patterns. But what you may not realize is you've also seen yourselves. Because assumption doesn't belong to one judge, one officer, one system." He gestured to the courtroom. "It lives here. In all of us, until we name it." The jury was silent, captivated. Turner tried to object once weakly but was waved off by Hale. The judge's hands were clenched. Ethan continued, "My client isn't perfect. He's not a symbol. He's a man. But today, he's being held responsible not for what he did but for what people thought he looked like." He turned to Marcus, who sat quietly, eyes wet but proud. "We talk about justice like it's a scale. But what happens when one side is always weighed down by history?" Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "You rebalance it." He walked back to his table. "The burden of proof is not on Marcus to prove he's innocent. It's on the system to prove it treated him fairly. It didn't, a beat. Now it's your turn to decide if that matters." He sat down. No applause, no cheers. Just silence, because everyone knew they'd just seen something rare. A scalpel in a world of hammers. Hale didn't look at Ethan as the jury was dismissed. He didn't look at Marcus, or the press, or the prosecutor. He looked at the crack in his bench, the one from the gavel strike he'd never meant to make. It had splintered deeper now, the wood beginning to split. He reached out, fingertips grazing it, and in that quiet moment, he realized the crack wasn't new. It had been forming for years. Ethan hadn't broken it. He'd simply revealed it. Hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood, throat tight. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Holloway, not guilty." Marcus's mother burst into tears. Reporters stormed out to file headlines. And Ethan simply stood, turned, and shook Marcus's hand. "I told you," he said. "Truth doesn't hide forever." After the crowd dispersed, Hale sat alone in his empty courtroom. The lights were dimmed. The press was gone. The power of the robe felt like dust on his shoulders. He looked at the boy who had once stood here silent, underestimated, mocked, and he looked at the man he became. In the same room, a knock echoed. Hale didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say, only one truth to accept. He'd been wrong, and Ethan had never needed his permission to prove it. The morning after the verdict, the front page of the New York Herald said it all. "Teen lawyer topples broken system. Holloway walks free." Ethan's picture was front and center, not in a courtroom, but exiting it, calm, no fist raised, no smile. Just a young man with tired eyes and a quiet spine of steel. Social media flooded with praise. Law professors quoted his closing argument. Civil rights leaders called him a symbol. Law schools began discussing internship offers before he even officially applied to the bar. But Ethan didn't care about any of it. He was already at his desk working another case. Another man, another arrest, same pattern, because the system hadn't changed, but it had been witnessed. Judge Hale arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. No coffee, no robe, just a plain suit, wrinkled, like he hadn't slept. The Judicial Review Board had called for a private session. Not a trial. Not yet, but a reckoning. 3 retired judges sat across from him in a narrow chamber, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp. Their words were professional, rehearsed, but each question was a blade. "Do you acknowledge the language you used during the Reeves case was inappropriate?" "Yes," Hale said quietly. "Do you believe your decisions across past cases demonstrated racial bias?" He hesitated. The answer, if spoken aloud, wouldn't just be an admission. It would be an obituary. To a reputation, a career, a man. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I don't know, he said finally. I think I've believed a lot of things that made me feel right, instead of being right. One of the judges folded her hands. So what now? Hale didn't have an answer. That same afternoon, Ethan returned to courtroom 5A not as a lawyer, not for a trial, just to sit. To feel the room when it was empty. He walked slowly down the aisle, tracing the walls with his eyes, the cracks in the floor, the faded wood of the jury box, the dent in the podium where someone once hit it too hard. He sat on the bench where Marcus had sat, hands folded, and then he turned and walked up to the judge's seat. He didn't sit in it, he just stood behind it, one hand on the backrest, and looked at the courtroom through that lens. Not with hunger, not with revenge, with perspective. What you see, he whispered to himself, depends on where you sit. He turned and left without a sound. That night, Judge Hale drafted a letter. No legalese, no excuses, just the truth. For years, I believed I was delivering justice, but I've learned that justice without reflection becomes arrogance. I see now that silence, too, is a decision. And so, this is mine. I resigned from the bench, not because I was forced to, but because it's time to listen, not speak. He placed the envelope on his desk, and for the first time in weeks, breath. The next day, the courthouse buzzed with disbelief. Did you hear? He stepped down. No scandal, no bribe. He just resigned. Some mocked, others shrugged, but a few, especially those who'd felt the weight of that bench, nodded. Quietly, respectfully, because real justice wasn't about gavel strikes and robes. It was about change. Even when it came to late. Marcus Holloway walked free, his name cleared, his record was erased. But the fear, the shame, that would take longer. Still, he smiled now, especially when he visited schools with Ethan to talk to kids who looked like him, kids who thought the system was too big, too white, too armored to touch. You just need one person, Marcus told them, who refuses to believe you're already guilty. And beside him, Ethan would add, sometimes, the best way to win is to stand when no one thinks you should. The courtroom sat empty again that weekend, but this time, the bench was uncovered, the rope gone. And on the judge's nameplate, someone had taped a simple sticky note. Handwritten. No signature. Poetic justice doesn't yell, it walks in late, and leaves the door open. Spring arrived early that year. The city bloomed with color, streets cleaner, air warmer, and yet something else had changed. In a courthouse once thick with silence, people spoke differently now, with care, with curiosity, with caution. Judges weighed their words more deliberately. Lawyers prepared cases knowing someone might finally be watching. Ethan Reeves had become more than a courtroom name. He had become a pause in every assumption. At a high school on the east side, a group of students sat wide-eyed in the auditorium. Ethan stood on stage, not in a suit, not in robes, but in his hoodie, hands in his pockets. He didn't talk about fame or headlines. He talked about listening, about walking into rooms that never wanted you there and staying anyway. He shared how silence wasn't always weakness, and calm wasn't surrender. And then he said something that made the room go still. Justice doesn't wear a face. It wears the truth. A kid in the front row raised his hand. How did you stay calm when the judge mocked you? Ethan smiled. Because I wasn't there to win a fight. I was there to finish a pattern. The crowd erupted in applause, not loud or wild, but deeply respectful, like a truth had landed and everyone knew it. Judge Hale now lived quietly in a smaller apartment overlooking the East River. The view wasn't grand, but it was honest. Each morning, he walked to the library. No driver, no security, no title to carry. He read more now, books he used to skim, histories he once dismissed. He even taught part-time at a local legal clinic, not as Judge Hale, but as Richard, the volunteer. Some students knew who he was, None called him out, but one day, a young woman approached him after class and said, "You're not what I expected." He asked, "Better or worse?" She replied, "Human, that's enough." He nodded. It was the most grace he'd felt in years. One afternoon, Hale sat quietly in the back of a small community courtroom. A new judge half his age, Latina, sharp-eyed presided. Ethan was present too, assisting a public defender. Their eyes met briefly, not with animosity, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement, like two pages of the same book. Finally turned, outside. The courthouse mural had been updated. It once featured blindfolded Lady Justice stoic, cold. Now it showed a diverse group of people, each holding up pieces of a broken scale, rebuilding it. And beneath it, painted in bold, quiet letters, "Justice isn't what you wear, it's what you carry." Ethan walked those steps daily, not with swagger but purpose. He wasn't famous anymore. The cameras had moved on, but the change remained. In the way clerks paused before dismissing someone. In this way jurors asked better questions. In this way defendants, especially those who wore hoodies, stood taller, because one boy had walked into a courtroom that tried to laugh at him and left it trembling with truth. Back at his apartment, Ethan filed another case. Same old story. Wrong place, wrong name, wrong face. But he smiled anyway, because now, every case wasn't just a defense, it was a reminder that silence doesn't mean surrender, that truth doesn't always roar, and that even in the quietest corners of injustice, a whisper can change everything.